we've seen inflation like hasn't been around in probably 40 years. And during my time as a real estate investor, I've worked in all different types of markets. So one of the things I want to talk about today is how to invest in real estate even when we're seeing high inflation numbers, and what you can do and what some of those strategies and tactics are so you can be successful even with inflation. How to invest in real estate during massive inflation. Well, what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about what is inflation, how inflation affects investing. We're going to talk about what you can do to invest during times of high inflation. So let's just talk about this. What the heck is inflation? You're hearing a lot about it, but inflation really is a decrease in the purchasing power of money, reflected in the general increase in prices of goods or services. Yeah, but what the heck does that mean? Well, this is what it means. Last year, it cost you $4 to buy a gallon of milk. And this year, it's costing you $4.50 to buy a gallon of milk. So it's 50 cents more, which is actually a pretty drastic increase. So you're paying more for the exact same thing. It's the same gallon of milk, but it's costing more this year than it did last year. That's what inflation basically is. You're paying more, and you're paying more for goods or services, and you're getting the same thing. You're not paying more and getting more. You're paying more and getting the same thing. That is the definition of inflation. So what type of things are affected by inflation? So inflation affects all aspects of the economy, from consumer spending to employment rates to government programs to tax policies to interest rate. So inflation can have a very broad and a very wide net and have an impact on some of these things, right? So items that are more expensive because of inflation, let's just talk in the last 12 months. So meat, poultry, fish, eggs, they're up 12.5%. Fruits, vegetables are up 5%. Electricity up 6.3%. Furniture and bedding up 13.8%. Jewelry, watches up 7.2%. Don't go out and buy jewelry, by the way. Well, I mean, you probably should buy a ring for your wife or your girlfriend before she becomes your wife, but it's not a good investment is all I'm trying to say. Rent has gone up about 3% depending upon where it is. So how can inflation be controlled? Like, what makes this lever? Who pulls the lever? And unfortunately, the central bank is going to be doing it, like the US Federal Reserve. They're the ones that can pull the lever, and this is the lever they pull, right? They change the interest rate that banks can borrow from other banks and from the Federal Reserve. So this encourages banks to borrow more money. So if they lower the short-term rates, banks are going to borrow more money, right? And it increases the money supply. There's more money that's out there. They're basically saying there's more dollars now than there used to be because we're increasing that supply. Now, if you raise the short-term rates, it has the opposite effect. It discourages borrowers and it decreases the money supply. There's less money in the markets, and this dampens the economic activity. So what investments do well during an inflationary period? Well, gold typically does. Commodities typically do. Real estate investment trusts typically do well. Real estate rental income typically does well. The S&P 500 typically does pretty well. We're going to focus in on real estate because most people that create wealth is through real estate. Real estate, we're going to talk about a long-term versus a short-term approach. So in the short term, the question is, what should I be doing? Now, if you are worried that the bottom's going to fall out, I doubt it's going to happen this year, but the bottom's going to fall out next year, then you want to be doing short-term investments. Now, the shortest term investment you can be doing is wholesaling. Wholesaling is a great way. We're going to talk about wholesaling in more detail here. Fix and flips is another way, and lending on short-term loans is going to be our third way as we talk not long-term. Now, let's first talk about wholesaling. For those of you that are not familiar with the idea of wholesaling, it's basically going out and finding an off-market property, and you get that property under contract, and then you sell or assign that contract to someone else, and they pay you a fee to do that. So for example, let's say you go out there and you find a great property, and you find that property for $100,000, right? And then you go and find some cash buyers and say, hey, would you buy this house for me for $110,000? And they say, yeah, sure, I would. Wonderful. So they give you $10,000, they take over the contract, and they close with the seller for the $100,000, and you walk away with $10,000. Now, the great thing about this is your risk is very limited. You're in and out of the transaction really fast, and because of that, your exposure, if there is a crash in an inflationary period and then a crash afterwards, is somewhat limited, or quite a bit limited, because you're only on the hook, for the time period that was actually out. So you may not even have to get a loan in wholesaling depending on what state you're in. So you sell the contract. That's really what it comes down to. Now, fix and flips is another one. I look at short-term, anything less than a year. We're gonna talk more about that, but fix and flips, you can typically buy and fix up the property. And the nice thing about it is that when you are in an inflationary period, it's a good time to get started, because if you make mistakes, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, if values went up 24% in the last 2 years, even if you bought the property and you didn't buy a good deal, if you could keep it for 2 years, now it would be a good deal to sell. So inflation can cover a lot of sins for real estate investors. Let's just put it that way. Okay, lending and short-term loans, short-term notes, 12 months or less. This is where we get into hard money lending or gap financing. That's what we're talking about when we're short-term lending. Those are types of things you can do, but you want to be in short-term, not long-term. You don't want to be buying some type of a note that's a 30-year note. That's not where I want to be when we're dealing with an inflationary period. Now, let's take the opposite approach and say, okay, we can play the short term, we can also play the long term, okay? So how do we play the long-term game? Well, the long-term game is purchasing a property and planning to hold it for 10 years plus, okay? If you're playing the long game, I believe over the next 10 years, the value will be worth more than it is today. Now, is that exactly 10 years? No. So you just gotta be careful when that music actually stops. Now, one of the things you can do, let's talk about this 10-year period, right? 10 years is arbitrary, but I'm basically saying between now and 30 years from now, are the house values gonna be worth more than they are today? Yes, they are. I believe that they are going to be. In 10 years, are they gonna be worth more? Yes, probably. Now, what if there's a crash in 10 years? Then it might take you 15 years. But if you're playing the long game, you're realizing, you know what? In the long term, property values only go up. I've shown the graphs in the past where you see, hey, property values are just going up. If you look at that, even with a 2008 crash that we saw, that still went up over the long term. The issue with this is staying power. How long can you hold those properties if there is a correction? Now, one of the nice things is when there is a correction in the real estate markets, you typically see rents go up, not go down, because people may be losing their houses and there's more tenants that are on the market. Something to be interesting. Put a note in that, because that's something you want to be aware of. Now, there's this whole principle of dollar cost averaging, and I want to make sure that you understand this. Recently, I did a full analysis and said, hey, what if you bought a property a year, every single year? You rented it, okay? And you took all the money from that rental and you paid down that first property in a snowball strategy, right? So you put it all towards this one, then towards this one, then towards this one. What would happen here? Well, so I said, let's take the worst time. Let's say you bought one in 2006 and 2007 and 2008, and then you bought in 2009 when values went down, and 2010 when they went down further and they started to come up. If we did that, there's this principle called dollar cost averaging, and this is used a lot in stocks. It's not used as much in real estate, but the principle's true. And this is the idea is, what you're basically doing is you're gonna buy on the high side, you're gonna buy on the low side. And you're basically saying, you know what, I can't time the markets. So rather than trying to time the markets, I am going to time when I purchase properties. So rather than buying 10 properties this year and then finding out I'm over leveraged and the market goes down next year or whatever, this is hypothetical, you're saying, no. I'm gonna buy a property a year for the next 10 years. I'm gonna hold them for 15 years, and I know overall I'm gonna be better off because I bought the high, I bought the low, but as an average, this is what I'm into each property, and that was better than doing nothing and people being afraid, oh, the market's gonna go down, the market's gonna go up, whatever the case is. You know what, it doesn't really matter. Just keep buying, because over the long haul, 30-year period, as long as you're not buying too many at one time, you're gonna come out better. Now, when should you kind of break that rule is, well, I like to say, and Warren Buffett said this the best, is you wanna buy when there's blood in the streets, man. So if there's blood in the streets, I think there's the exception to you buying like a house a year, and it doesn't have to be every year, it could be every other year, whatever the case is, but it's, every 3 years, but you're buying them on periods of time. You're not buying them based upon market unless you see blood in the streets, and that's where you want to get serious and maybe double down on that strategy.